share with you and my constituents why and what I'm thinking, and follow the strong suggestion of a friend of mine to not just think more, but share more as to what I think and where I'm coming from so that people understand. But my first observation, and I got to remind us all of this, public safety is not a partisan issue. Trying to reduce crime and keep our community safe is not a partisan issue. I think we all, not just campaigned on it, but would share personally and publicly how important this is. If there's any disagreement today, it's disagreement over specific ideas on how to get there. But let me reiterate, public safety is not a partisan issue, and I'm saddened when there are folks both in these chambers and outside that try to paint the lines that way. I've shared in the past, not just privately in our conversations, but even publicly at this microphone. I'll give you one example of the community that I grew up in, and this may come as a surprise to many, the community I choose to still live in, a community known as Pacoima in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. I've shared from this microphone the stories about growing up there and particularly the tough times when it came to violence in the 80s, where open-air drug dealing and prostitution and gang violence was not only not uncommon, but indeed commonplace. And having lived through what that means for people who live in that environment, people trying to raise families in that environment. I may not share the stories too often, but I'm encouraged to remind my colleagues of that. And I share that not to point to something that may or may not have happened 20 years ago, but I'll give an example of something that happens today. Having come into this Senate chambers from the perspective of a former council member, the former president of the Los Angeles City Council, where reducing crime has been one of the toughest challenges for the city over the course of many, many years. Working with the police chief, the local command staff in the San Fernando Valley, when we know it's going to get hot because of the time of the year, when we know there's been a homicide and there's a high probability for retaliation, one of the tools that's very effective in trying to keep control, I'll give you two of the tools. One is, you know what, there are folks out there on probation and parole. Let's go check on them. It's part of the terms and conditions of their status. And just checking on folks can help keep folks maybe settled for a little bit. Another one of the tools is not just to police our way out of everything, but to utilize our intervention specialists in their unique way to try to keep control of a community and not let violence get more out of hand than it may already is. Folks, that happens in the community where I live. And when I talk about those checks on parolees or folks on probation, I can open up my front door in the morning and see cops on my street wearing their vests, knocking on doors. That's where I live and a perspective that I come to this conversation with. Senator Hollingsworth, I consider a friend. We have certainly political and ideological differences, but as much as we get along, I just have to respectfully take issue with something you said that may read well in the paper tomorrow, maybe your hometown paper, but I don't believe this is a liberal agenda in disguise. I don't believe this is an exploitation of a fiscal challenge that the state of California has. I think this is a putting forth of ideas that we may or may not agree with, trying to tackle an issue. So I'm torn with the package before us because I see elements that I can actually support and feel good about. the credits for rehabilitation and education, the inmates that take it upon themselves to successfully complete programs, I think is a good thing. The instruments, the tools for smarter decision-making when it comes to parole violations. I think that's being smart on crime, which is part and parcel with being, tough on crime, my opinion. Alternative custody for the elderly and the medically infirm, as Senator Wright so articulately gave us very real examples of. I think it's hard to disagree with that. There's other elements of this package that give me personally some concern. The alternative custody, a little bit more blankets, and a little too flexible for folks who just may happen to be within their 12 months with a lot less flexibility based on what they may be in for or what their behavior has been while in custody. Some of the paperwork that's been floated to us says, well, this is only going to apply to lower risk inmates. Well, there's a difference between lower risk and low risk. Lower risk, as I've asked and as I've seen paperwork on, just means you're not high risk. But even low and that in-between area, moderate, has cast a pretty wide net. So I do have questions and concerns. Program funding reduction, as I read the bullet points, is part of this package. Programs like substance abuse counseling, getting their funding reduced. Programs like vocational training, getting their funding reduced. Programs like educational programs, getting their funding reduced. And part of why I'm grappling with this is because it's not just this package here in isolation. For local communities like the city I come from, like the neighborhood I live in, it's really a little bit more of a perfect storm. It's not necessarily thousands and thousands and thousands of inmates guaranteed to return to our communities, but it is a real possibility. I come from a district that's going to get a disproportionate share of folks coming home, whether they're ready or not. It's a perfect storm because we're doing this as local governments are grappling with budget cuts. People I know who may be working in probation, increasing workloads, furlough days, that's not a good combination. When police departments or cities in each and every one of our districts are struggling to find the funds to hire more, if not to expand police forces, but to sort of backfill for attrition that's natural. Funding cuts or grappling with the budgets for not just police departments, but the probation services out there, the intervention specialists that I mentioned earlier in my remarks, as well as prevention. I know some folks have said, well, this, as a package is sort of less aggressive than stuff that's been voted on before, whether it's been a couple of months or in the last couple of years. But I woke up this morning reminding myself that, our climate's a little bit different too. Reducing the inmate population during our tough budget times doesn't allow us to invest as we should in the wraparound or supportive or reentry programs and services that would be ideal as we do this, but we can't afford to do it in an ideal fashion right now. And I also ask myself as I grapple with this package, really, what's the question we're trying to ask? What's the problem we're trying to solve? What would define success in the state of California vis-a-vis public safety or corrections and rehabilitation? Are we being driven to consider this package today by a budget challenge? I think that's a better way of asking what Senator Hollingsworth said earlier. Is the correction budget up, and has it been growing at a very high rate over the last decade? The answer to that is yes. Is crime in my community down, and in most communities, and has it been on the decline in that last decade or two? The answer to that is yes. Are we being driven to do this by the feds, these federal lawsuits that California finds itself in? Maybe, maybe not in the minds of some. Is the prison system in the state of California, quote unquote, overcrowded? The answer is yes. But when I go home and talk to my constituents and we ask ourselves the question, is crime down? The answer to that is yes. Are we being driven to do this through the lens of public safety in our communities? I like to think that's what drives my thinking and my decision making. We look at some of the images from institutions in the state, and you see the concerns about inmates being double bunked and triple bunked. Is that reality in the state of California? The answer to that is yes. But I go home to my constituents, and we ask ourselves, is our neighborhood safer compared to 10 and 20 years ago? And the answer to that is yes. By the same token, I recognize that crime being down does not justify the conditions that exist in our prison system. We do need reform. Crime being down does not diminish the budget pressures that our correction system is placing on the state of California and forcing us into tough decisions between this versus education versus healthcare versus infrastructure versus anything else. Crime being down does not undo the need to revisit the sentencing laws in the state of California. So as I think through all these things and I feel through all these things and I share all these things with you, I conclude my comments still very torn. And I know we have a couple more speakers here before we end this debate. But I can guarantee you this, that whether or not this package passes the legislature today and is signed by the governor today, our work will not be over. Our work will not be over, and we all have to recommit to truly working together and trying to change this fundamentally. But let me, because I remind myself and I'd urge you all to also consider, is this what is best for public safety in our communities, and viewing it through that lens, not just as a budget balancing exercise and not just as, you know, what may or may not be in the system. Thank you.
Huff.